Welcome everybody to this panel discussion on Black Box AI. We're just going to wait a minute or two for some people to join, and we'll be going shortly. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll get started now. Welcome to this panel discussion on Black Box AI explainability. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of each of the lands from which we meet and their elders past, present and emerging. I would like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. My name's Kate Morton. I'm a special counsel in the Technology and Telecommunications Group at the international law firm Bird & Bird. We at Bird & Bird are very pleased to be hosting what I'm sure will be an insightful discussion. Tonight's event is co-hosted by the Australian Society for Computers and the Law Emerging Technology Workstream and by Macquarie University. Tonight we've got a fantastic panel of experts, and it's been moderated by Dr. Rita Matulinity. Rita is a senior lecturer and researcher in law at Macquarie University. She's an international expert in intellectual property and technology law. Her most recent research focusing on legal and governance issues around artificial intelligence technologies. She currently leads projects on government use of face recognition technologies, legal challenges and possible solutions, and towards more transparent and explainable artificial intelligence technologies in healthcare. Rita has over 45 research papers published by leading international publishers and is invited to present her research in conferences in Europe, US, Japan, Hong Kong and Australia. She has prepared expert reports for the European Commission, the European Patent Office, and for governments of South Korea and Lithuania. She's a member of the Management Committee of the Australian Society for Computers and the Law. Just a quick reminder, this event will be recorded, and we ask that you keep your mics and cameras off during the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please include them in the Q&A or chat functions at the bottom of your screen, and a panelist will answer as many as possible in the time available. I'm greatly looking forward to hearing from our great panel. Rita, thank you, and now over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for the lovely introduction, and thank you for the co-host of the event to make this event happen. We really were looking forward to a live event, but circumstances have changed from the time we started planning the event, so I hope to meet all of you sometime in a live event very soon. So now, thank you. So let me start with a very brief introduction to the topic that we're going to explore today. So as we know, artificial intelligence or algorithmic decision-making has been increasingly employed in different industries and sectors, starting from recommendation algorithms on YouTube and Spotify to AI in healthcare, social welfare system, law enforcement, and judicial administration. We are also aware that there might be a lot of legal and ethical issues surrounding AI. The notorious Robodebt case has demonstrated that AI decision-making might lead to a lot of very significant errors, and there are serious accountability issues. Face recognition technologies are known to often contain bias and discriminate between genders and races. Clear view technology, which is one of face recognition technologies that was developed by a US company and trialed by Australian police, was developed by simply scraping photos from social media profiles and thousands of other websites to develop that technology, which raises a lot of privacy issues. Research shows that there is a lack of trust in AI. Now, for these and other reasons, there has been a call for more transparent and explainable AI. Apparently, or it's been argued that we all need to know when AI or algorithmic decision-making is being used and for what purpose, and when algorithms are making decisions about us, these decisions need to be explainable. Now, there is a belief that if we have more explainable, transparent AI, it might help for public or experts to identify all these problems that I mentioned before easier and at an earlier stage. It might make institutions more accountable. It might enable individuals to challenge decisions made by AI that affect their rights. At the same time, there has been a lot of some skeptics suggesting that maybe we don't need more transparency and explainability with relation to AI. So we drive cars, but we don't necessarily want to know how those cars function. We just want to know that they are safe to drive. So why do we really need to know how AI functions? Some have, others argued that more transparency and explainability will not actually lead to the solution of any of the problems mentioned before. And it would simply lead to some so-called transparency fallacy. AI experts suggest that explaining AI is very difficult or sometimes even impossible. And if it's possible, an explanation might come at the cost of accuracy and security. So in this webinar, I would like to explore three main questions. First, do we really want more transparent and explainable AI? And if so, in what situations, in which contexts? Second question is, if we do want more transparent and explainable AI, what are the reasons underlying the lack of transparency, explainability, or what are the reasons behind this black box AI? And then the third question is, so far, what has been done to ensure more transparency and explainability in the context of algorithmic decision-making by businesses, by IT specialists, and by lawyers, and what we could or should do next to go one step further and ensure that we have sufficient and adequate transparency and explainability with relation to AI. So before we start this discussion, I'd like to introduce our panelists. And while I'm introducing, I would invite panelists to switch their cameras on so that the audience can see you. So the first panelist I'd like to introduce is Aurélie Jacquet, who is a national international expert in AI. She's a member of the New South Wales Government AI Advisory Committee, a chair of the Standards Committee representing Australia at the International Standards on AI. She's an expert at the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers and works with them on various initiatives related to AI. She's a member of the European AI Alliance and Australian Computer Society's AI Ethics Committee. And most notably, in 2021, she won the Australia-New Zealand Women in AI and the Law Award and was recognized by Women in AI Ethics as one of the 100 brilliant women in AI ethics globally. Welcome, Aurélie. Now, the second panelist I'd like to introduce is Kimberly Weatherall, who is a professor of law at the University of Sydney and the chief investigator with the ARS Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making Society. She's a fellow at the Gradient Institute, a research institute developing ethical AI, a research affiliate of the Humanizing Machine Intelligence Group at the Australian National University, and a member of the Australian Computer Society's Advisory Committee on Ethics. In her current research, on collection and governance of data, Kimberly's goal is to ensure that data and predictive analytics are developed in ways that are beneficial to people and society. Welcome, Kimberly. I'll turn now to our third speaker, which is Ali Akbari, who is a director at KPMG and the National AI Capability Lead. AI is an industry expert with a PhD from Tokyo Institute of Technology, specialized in computer vision. In the past 15 years, he has combined the science aspect of AI to bring to life many commercial solutions around the APAC region. Among many projects, he has led the production of the first transactional analytics solution for automated credit risk decisioning at Commonwealth Bank, and the intelligence simulation engine of the largest biometric solution for a federal government organization in Australia. In addition to technical expertise, Ali has been involved in creating AI ethics frameworks and is a member of Standards Australia AI Standardization Committee. Welcome to Ali as well. And we turn to our fourth speaker, so at last but not the least, Tiberio Cayetano, a chief scientist at the Graduate Institute. He's a machine learning researcher and leader, having worked in Brazil, Canada, France, and Australia. He was a researcher at NICTA, which is now Data 61, for 10 years. He published extensively in the premier machine learning research venues and graduated numerous PhD students, among whom are leading data scientists, researchers, and academics at top universities and industry labs across Australia, the US, and Europe. He co-founded Ambiata, later acquired by Australia's largest general insurer, IAG, where he led the design of decision-making algorithms that have touched millions of consumers across several industries. Tiberio is an adjunct professor at UNSW, an honorary professor at the ANU, and an advisor for the OECD on AI. So let me warmly welcome all the panelists. It is really our great honor, pleasure to have all of you here, and we really appreciate the time that you devoted for this important discussion. So let us start with the discussion questions. So our first question is there actually a problem of this lack of transparency and explainability with relation to AI? And if so, in which particular sectors or scenarios we would actually want more transparency around the use of AI and better explainable decisions? Kimberly, would you like to be the first to share your views on that?
Absolutely. And in answer to your question, do we have a problem? Yeah, we have a problem. So Australian governments, for example, are far from, if you think about transparency first, Australian governments are far from transparent about their current and planned use of data and data-driven decision-making, especially for predictive and automated purposes. There's no one place you can go, for example, to find out what AI or automated systems governments are using, what data they're using. You might be able to dig around procurement sites and find out something, but not a lot. When it comes to the private sector, again, not really. There's certainly no current legal obligation on firms to tell you when they're using automated systems to make decisions about you. They could choose to, but they won't necessarily do so. And when it comes to explainability, details on how the algorithms work, again, at least in public, we know relatively little. People often talk about their awesome computing technology, their innovative technology, these great systems that they're using, but we don't know much about what's under the hood and what data's been used, either to train it or to inform it. But, you know, all of that said, like, yes, there's a problem, but do we always want detailed technical explanations? Do we always want full transparency? No, of course we don't. It's really important to be clear about why we're seeking an explanation and what we're going to do with it once we have it. So in the case of some whiz-bang medical system that does awesome diagnosis, I might not care much about how it works. It's like your car example. What I want to know is, does it work? And does it work for people like me? But if the government is going to use data, if it's going to make predictions about the course of people's life and then make decisions on that basis or intervene on that basis, then basic questions of democratic accountability do arise. We have a right to know what the government is doing. If government is making decisions that impact on individuals' legal rights, then natural justice questions arise, right? We want to know that the decision is made on the basis of good data and for good reasons. If I want to contest a decision, whether it's a private or public sector decision, I might need some kind of explanation, or the court might need some kind of explanation about what both the system and the underlying data. And I might need that information to see if I have a good claim, and the court might need that information even in more detail in order to adjudicate that claim. So you really have to think quite carefully about the context in which you're thinking about either transparency or an explanation, because that's going to shape what you ask for and the level of detail at which you ask for it. And on that last point, on those questions of detail, all I can say is we have an awful lot of work to do, right? About when transparency and explanation should be required, to whom, who are you going to reveal the information to? Sometimes it might involve confidential or private information and you need a smaller audience. Some things can be public, or some level of detail can be public. And we need to think an awful lot about how we do explanations, because I've spent enough time talking to people in the technology field, in the industries, that, there's many different ways you can present explanations or generate explanations, and working out which ones are going to work for which context is actually not a straightforward question at all. And if you think about it more broadly, if you're talking about explanations that are going to be offered to the general public, we already know that statistical knowledge is really quite low amongst the general population. You present them with a bunch of detailed statistics and weights and percentages for different factors, and people are going to glaze over, and you might even defeat the purpose of the transparency and explainability in the first place. You might generate less trust rather than more trust. So do we have a problem? Yes. Is there a lot of work to do? Absolutely. Do we absolutely 100% always need a deep technical explanation of how something's happened? No, we need to think really carefully about what we're asking for and why and what it's going to lead to.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. I will turn now to Ali and would like to hear his views from technologists and in industry perspective. Do you agree with Kimberly? Do you have any other opinion?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, I agree. And it's difficult to add more, but I think I will emphasize on that context and the level of the explainability or the transparency that we want. Completely agree with what you said, Kimberly. Sometimes if we want to overdo it, it can have the reverse impact. We should understand for what purpose do we want explainability, and to whom are we providing it. So we need to adjust that level correctly. There is absolutely clear demand from the public. We have been hearing all of these questions and interest from everyone about, okay, what exactly are these systems? How does it work? Why does it make these sort of decisions, and so on and so forth. In a research that we did together with University of Queensland, we see like about 76% of the Australian public, they are demanding and asking for more explanation and transparency in the use of AI. Another 14% are neutral. There is only 10% of the Australians who believe, yeah, it's enough. We have enough explanations. We know things. The other thing is we should be realistic about what do we want to achieve from this explanation. Sometimes it goes too much on to some extremes. Like if we provide all of the details of the algorithms and then explain the technical side of it, do we achieve what we really want? Because sometimes that is what is being asked, but that is not really what people mean, but what they want. We see also clear lack of enough literacy in the general public. Again, in this sort of researches, we see a large portion of the people, although they have heard about AI, but they don't have a realistic understanding of what is AI and what are the extent of it, and they can't separate the myth from reality of it. So yeah, in general, I think there is a lot of work to be done here, but it's not easy. We need to have more of these discussions, not only for the technology providers, but also for the regulatory side and the public side, to better understand what is the best and achievable explanation and transparency for the AI systems.
Thanks so much, Ali. I understand Tiberio wants to add something to this.
Hello, Rita. Thank you very much. Thanks for all my colleagues here today and the audience. I pretty much agree. I don't have much to add. I would just perhaps make a couple of comments. One is, it would be reasonable to expect that if under the law an explanation is required for a given type of decision, it shouldn't really matter whether that decision is made by people or whether that decision is made by machines. That's the first thing. Second thing is that explainability, as touched both by Kim and Ali, explainability and transparency, they sort of serve purposes. They're not ends in themselves. They serve purposes. And for different purposes, the importance of each of them is going to be different. And the relative importance of them is going to be different in comparison with other things we also care about, like accuracy, for example, in the example that Kim mentioned in a healthcare scenario. I don't really care if I understand why this neural network actually labeled the type of cancer as being originated in my pancreas as opposed to my liver, provided it's much more accurate in detecting the primary source of the cancer. So, and likewise, there are many other settings in which you would prefer to trade off things in a different way. So I just wanted to add those few comments there, but in essence, I think we are all in agreement that there is a big problem, although we don't quite know exactly what that problem is, and much of the work that is to be done is in actually outlining the details of the formulation of that problem in particular circumstances so that we can approach it effectively.
Thanks so much, Tiberio. Oh, great. So we all agree essentially that yes, we have a problem, that yes, we don't need explanations every time and in every scenario, and we have to look at really, why, for what purpose. So our next question is, so if we have that lack of transparency, explainability currently, and that black box problem, so what are the underlying reasons? And I understand there are technological reasons, there are possibly cultural reasons and legal ones. So I'll come back. I'll go to Tiberio again now, and I'll ask you, could you explain us? So as far as we know, or we've heard that explaining decisions made by AI might be very difficult or not possible at all, and it comes at the at the cost of accuracy or security, and or is it actually possible to explain more or less every decision? It's just about how much time and money you spend on that. Could you tell us about, is there a really technological problem there to explain decisions made by AI?
If we could fully explain perfectly accurately every decision of an AI, we would be constraining the progress of AI because the human brain is limited. That's the first observation, and that is an observation that's, I think it's fair to say, that's widely shared by computer scientists who understand how the technology is built. In fact, if we choose to use very simple AI, like traditional predictive models based on just summing different factors and applying some transformations to that sum, or using decision trees and so on, it's easier for humans to actually understand what's going on. But usually what happens is that that AI, so to speak, ends up not actually being able to drive a car, or ends up not being able to actually detect what's the source of a cancer. It ends up not being able to actually understand natural language or images. So you actually have to accept that you won't perform well if you demand similar levels of understanding. So I think that truth needs to be well understood, because it's a truth. There are mathematical theorems proving that that is the case. Now, those are some reasons, complex reasons why, technical reasons why we can't attain perfect understanding of any possible AI. That is not to say that we can't have a good approximate understanding of the main reasons why a complex AI system has made a decision. In fact, there is significant research that tries to understand, tries to use techniques to find the gist of what the AI is trying to do in a way that is human intelligible. But even those efforts themselves, they are subject to weaknesses. In fact, it's not hard to game the system. It's not hard to create an explanation that is very convincing. It leverages deep knowledge of good rhetoric. It actually is kind of right, but it's actually deceptive insofar as it isn't actually explaining the thing that matters about the system. And if you have a good AI system trying to produce that intelligible explanation that is not actually getting to the real bottom of the problem, there you go. It's a problem again. So there are so many challenges, and I just try to outline a little bit of the technical complexity underlying those.
Thanks so much, Tiberio. I know that Ali is also, could discuss this from technical perspective, but I'd like to ask him to look at it from a business perspective. So, are there also other business reasons in business culture that leads to the lack of transparency, explainability? Do business already thinking, and do they understand that they need to use AI that is explainable, or they need to be more transparent with what they do with AI as far as public members are concerned?
Yeah. So yes, it's possible to separate business from technology to some extent. There are businesses who are already familiar with the explainability requirements, and this is if we talk in the context of AI as a broader concept of algorithmic decision making. So, for example, we have these sort of credit decisioning systems within banks, and it has been for many years there, and the law and regulatory are asking them to make these decision-making processes transparent and explainable, and there is audit processes, and the banks should be able to explain how these models work to the regulatory organizations. So we already have that to some extent, but in one way, sometimes we hit with those technical complexity and difficulties. So for example, even though banks are already familiar with it and they are open and they want to do explainable models, but when we move more towards more complex models, then they hit the barrier of, if they use these more complex models, although they look like more accurate and performing better, but because they cannot explain it and they cannot justify the way it's asked from them, then they will just refrain from using them because they are forced by law. So that's one round. The other thing is we see also various levels of transparency and using explainable AI in different organizations, because we don't have that sort of enforcement to all of the businesses. We have highly regulated businesses like bank and insurance and health, etc. But we have other sectors which are not following this sort of strict regulations. Therefore, they might not be even aware of it's something that is required. So we have a mix of not enough attention, just simply missing that it's an important aspect, or sometimes there is concerns of exposing the trade secrets. The other one is the complexity of those explanations. Another case that we can see very frequently is not all of the technologies that are being used in an AI system are built in the same organization. So, for example, if we want to use some natural language processing engines which are built by other providers in our audit processes, even if we want to be transparent and explainable, but because it is some other company's IP, we don't have those information to provide. Yeah, I think those are a few aspects, but there is still a lot to discuss if you want to.
Thanks so much, Ali. That's a great insight. And you already touched upon another kind of aspect, this legal reasons. And I want to ask Aurélie her opinion, in addition to those technological reasons and kind of which I would call like business culture reasons, are there also legal reasons, current laws or absence of particular laws that affect this lack of transparency of explainability?
Sure, I'm happy to go into it, but I'll present maybe a slightly different perspective. So on knowing whether AI makes a decision or not, I think it's going to become less and less relevant, because you will have AI systems pretty much everywhere. So, and in very odd parts of your product. So to actually inform and tell people that the decisions to be made by AI will be less and less relevant, as Tiberio mentioned. Then on the transparency part, so this is also an old debate. I used to work for algorithmic traders. At some point they were asked in the US to be more transparent and to publish the algorithm. Obviously, this didn't work. So the transparency we're talking and the explainability we're talking is slightly different. My view is there's no need for more requirements. It will be driven by the outcome. If you go to court, at the moment, we already see what's happening. If you're not able to explain what your algorithm is doing, you'll end up in a battle of experts that will put test queries and decide what's the output of your algorithm. So if you don't want to end up with this type of battle of expert, I think you need to look at transparency and explainability with a different lens, which is not just the AI system, but how and why did you let this algorithm do what it did? And that's not just the algorithm itself, it's a risk management, it's a governance you had over it. Because to be honest, if you can't explain why you let this output happen and made a decision to lend to X many people or to enter in that many trades that caused harm, well, you end up to being negligent. So just to involve the exact present law we've got in front of us, you need to be able to provide an explanation, not of the algorithm, but of your risk management process of the AI, of your oversight, and why this output happened the way it happened. Secondly, there's another reason for transparency that will happen. is, and you see it already, AI often will be adopted, provided by a developer and deployed in a company that will use it then to actually for lending. So let's say you will have a platform that will provide AI services and that will be leveraged by, let's say, a financial service company to offer a loan. In this case, what's going to happen, and you see also the legislation moving, is you're responsible for the output. So where transparency is going to be essential is in the responsibility of the manufacturer of the AI system and of the user of the AI system. And you see already the manufacturer will not take all responsibility on board because they are developing the algorithm. But when it comes to training it and using on the data, it will be the data of that financial services company. So you see that providers are already saying, being transparent about what the algorithm can and cannot do. And then it's for the users to actually understand how they risk manage the algorithm once they, when it's learned on their data and they have to manage the output. The last piece of this equation is, in order, the one thing that's different with AI is that someone will not be able to understand the AI system. They will only understand the decision. So in order to have contestability and allow people to make a claim in court, that's when the explainability piece comes again. You will be able, the organization will have to explain why that decision was made and how. And again, that's not just about the AI system, it's about the risk management, the governance that's around the AI system.
Thanks so much, Aurélie. That's very interesting. So my impression is that we have already pressure from legal system when we have something goes wrong and the dispute reaches courts. That's when businesses will have already to understand that they have that transparency, explainability. They should have it, implement their systems. And in your opinion, it's not about the lack of laws. Well, very, very interesting. Thank you. Let's move now to the third question. So we've kind of looked at different types of, I think Tiberia wants to add something to this question. Yes.
I just want to fully concur with Aurélie there. The problem is largely a problem of governance. It's largely a problem of ensuring accountability. It's largely a problem of identifying in which ways the introduction of automated decision-making challenges or stresses our existing systems of accountability in society. Because we've got systems of accountability that have been in place for a long time, regulatory structures and legal systems and many others that try to ensure that in case something goes wrong, there is a mechanism not only to identify the cause, but also provide incentives for that not happening again, either positive or negative incentives that the law is very well known for. We need to ensure that we uplift our governance systems to actually maintain that level of accountability or improve on that level of accountability, which often is not that great with the introduction of AI systems. And as Aurélie put it, there are several risks that actually show up once you introduce AI that are often overlooked, that are basically not accounted for in existing systems of accountability because they tacitly assume that it's humans who are making the decisions as opposed to machines. I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Tiberio. Oh, great. Now let's move then to the third part of our discussion. So after trying to kind of overview some of the possible reasons why we currently don't have sufficient transparency, explainability, let's talk about what has been done so far to increase this transparent explainability from different perspectives. So I will maybe move to Ali and to tell us a bit about the in the marketplace. Do we have this algorithms with this explainability functions in the market, and do we or are they becoming a mainstream type of technologies because companies understand that their technology needs to be more explainable, or is it still a very small niche? And do you think things are going to change in the market soon?
Yeah, so in general, we see an increasing trend of attention and more actions from the businesses on the AI explainability and becoming more transparent. It's being driven by many different factors. Some of them, realizing how this sort of failures in the AI systems can impact overall business, the risk on the reputation, and also in general, the end goal of all of these, building all of these AI systems in order to achieve a specific business target. And if the target customers and the target market, they don't trust the systems and they don't adopt it and they don't start using it, basically they won't achieve the target they wanted in the first place. And we see that transparency and explainability, it drives the trust, which is at the end will drive the overall adoption of these AI systems. So there is more and more increasing attention to it. It's not like coming kind of, explainability coming as a part of the technology that is coming together. There are various different approaches to it. And in order to achieve those challenges on the in-depth explainability of the complex algorithms, we see other like workarounds and simpler approaches are coming to place. So trying, for example, to explain by examples rather than trying to explain the algorithm itself. So when a decision is made and the decision is being questioned, then rather than explaining these are all details of the algorithm, it's being given, this case is similar to that case, which we have seen in the previous, in the historical cases, and that is why we believe it should be some similarities between the cases. So that's just an example, but yeah, we see that companies are trying to come up with simpler ways to achieve that. And the other thing which Tiberio mentioned, which is very important, we see this awareness of transparency and explanation is not only about the algorithms. There is a huge and important factor of the data itself and the approach that we came up to that algorithm at the end. So these are areas that we see there are more attention paid to. I see the trend positive. So I hope that soon we will see improvement in the area.
Great, thanks so much, Ali. So it is great to see that businesses are already doing something and the trend is positive, but apparently we're not yet there. So my question to Aurélie would be about standardizing explainability and transparency in AI. So I understand that International Standard Organization is developing standards on explainable and on explainable AI. So do you think these standards will be adopted anytime soon, and will companies just take them and follow them, implement in their practices, or are any risks or problems with this approach by encouraging standardization in the industry?
So my committee is actually working on the standardization of AI altogether. As part of that, we're looking at explainability and transparency. Currently, we've got 8 standards that are published. We've got 20 that are underway. And I'm lucky, I can see, well, Ali is on the committee, as I mentioned, and I can see also in the chat, a few of the committee members, so really happy to have them here. So our work is to really lead the AI best practice on all the different topics. So yes, obviously I'm leading the standards, so I'm a big supporter of ensuring that industry have best practice when it comes to trustworthy AI, explainability, and transparency. The reason for that is the technology is moving so fast. I think standards present the best forum where you've got academia, government, and effectively industry all together that are working together on those topics with their diverse knowledge. And you've got 50 countries that are working together on that same topic. So this is one of the best way to get to a standard on AI that will cover all the many different topics, including explainability and transparency. And ISO has got the best record like on developing those standards for very complex topic when you have system like AI that are socio-technical. And to answer one of the questions in the chat, when we look whether explainability will drive accuracy, I'm actually hoping that, like, you need, again, you need accuracy. Your output will need to be accurate before you release it. Again, otherwise, again, what you end up is with outputs that are not reliable. So unless you don't need to care about the impacts that those output has in the wider society, then it doesn't matter. So for example, if the algorithm is picking little cats for dogs, then maybe that doesn't matter. But when we're talking about using systems like Compass that are used in the US and a few other countries to decide on sentencing, then you need accuracy first and make sure that you'll be able to explain why you've got accurate results. Higher view system that used to choose people to choose who to hire, and we'll see it now. AI is tested for lending by a few of the financial services company. So I think, again, if you don't want a negligent outcome, you'll have to explain why you had this outcome, and that will be transparency, explainability, but not just of the AI system, but of your broader risk management of those systems. And that's where the standards can help.
Thanks so much, Aurélie. I will now turn to Kimberly with the same question. Apologies for the noise, for the background noise. Family is out of control. So Aurélie was talking about the standards as possible solution. What about the legal policy measures that could possibly encourage more transparency, explainability? Do you see it as a possible solution? Probably some of us are aware that in European Union, there is so-called right of explanation when decisions are automatically generated. Is it a way for Australia to follow, or what other different legal or regulatory measures we could be thinking of?
Is law the answer? Always a good question. Look, the GDPR is interesting, isn't it? The General Data Protection Regulation you're talking about there, with various explanatory requirements, Article 13, Article 14, that require companies collecting data to disclose if they're using automated decision making and provide meaningful information about the logic involved. And the idea about that is it is coupled with that Article 22 piece, which says, you know, people have a right not to be subject to entirely automated decision making. So, you know, one of the interesting things about that GDPR provision is you've got a kind of transparency, but it is linked to a purpose, right? Which is that people can challenge these decisions, at least if they're solely automated. You know, and I suppose, I mean, the benefit of the GDPR approach is that at least it's something, right? It creates some right for people to find out what is going on, and it provides that right even in a context, you know, without you having to go to court to get that explanation. You know, because Aurelia is quite right. There are many cases where an explanation will be required to be produced. We don't necessarily want to have to go to court every time in order to find that out. And that's the weakness of the existing law. You know, you have to actually go to court in order to find these things out. There are other problems with the GDPR. You know, the Article 22 right only applies to solely automated decision making. So if you put a human in the loop somewhere, that can be enough to avoid that right to challenge the decision making. I mean, to my mind, our starting point here in Australia is actually, it's not the GDPR, it's what the Human Rights Commission has just said, because they've just come out with a final report quite recently, and it included a range of proposals, including proposals around both transparency and explainability. You know, transparency said that, you know, government needs to do an audit of the automated decision, the automated systems that it's using, that there should be this right to know if government or business is using an automated system in making a significant decision about you. In terms of explainability, it affirmed basically what Tiberio said earlier. If you would be entitled to an explanation if a human made a decision, then nothing should change just because it's a computer and it's automated. The Human Rights Commission absolutely affirmed that position. The government should never use a system to make decisions about people if that system cannot generate a reason for a decision. So a lot of the things that we have been talking about tonight as legal, as, you know, basics, the Human Rights Commission has come out and said we should do something about that. So that should be a starting point for conversation. It's not necessarily my perfect end point. You know, if we're going to be told every time some sort of automated decision is used, we are going to be driven nuts by pop-ups and I agree and tick boxes, and it will quite literally drive us all insane, even more than currently. You know, transparency, explainability, like, they shouldn't exist for their own sake. They should exist where there's a need for them. So we need to think more carefully about that. But look, you know, the other thing about all of these legal suggestions around explainability and transparency, and this is coming up a lot in the questions, I'm loving the questions in the chat, is that, you know, the real question that we need to be getting to is that question of accountability. So we need to be thinking about cases where all of this is going to fall down, where an obligation to be transparent or to provide explanations, you know, where you're entitled to one, isn't going to work because the decisions, there is no right to challenge the decision. You know, do you really have a right to challenge a decision that a bank makes to refuse you a loan? No. So are you going to end up in court requiring an explanation of how that happened? Probably not. So, you know, I actually started looking at this. You know, there's situations where there's an actual obligation, particularly the private sector, to explain the decisions it's making are more limited than you think. You know, you need to be able to find the legal hook for liability or accountability. So that in many ways is where we should be putting our attention first. You know, someone was bringing up the robo-debt example before. That's obviously not a transparency problem, not an explainability problem. Way too many people knew exactly what was going on and that it was illegal. The problem was an accountability one. There was no forum, or, you know, all the many forums in which there ought to have been accountability that ought to have been effective just failed, as Terry Carney pointed out in his 7 Veils article. So, you know, agree with Tiberio. We could put in requirements and we can make the Human Rights Commission recommendations a starting point for some sort of legal requirement. We won't get any kind of transparency, I think, without that. And there are some fundamentals around democratic accountability that we need transparency from government. But we shouldn't think this is a panacea, and the biggest attention we need to pay is to where these systems are going to fail, where there is no right to an explanation and we won't find out what's going on. And, you know, most importantly, where we currently lack the mechanisms to hold people accountable for some of these decisions. you know, the other really disturbing thing about robo-debt is if you read that judgment that was issued at the time of the settlement, you know, the court effectively saying the argument that the government had any duty of care to do this properly or to do this well or to avoid this kind of harm to people was a weak argument, which as a lawyer I find kind of shocking. Like, we've talked a lot about negligence tonight. I'm not sure that negligence is going to cover us enough. So that's where we, you know, sorry, I'm going on. We need to pay attention to accountability. I think Aurelie wants to speak now.
Yes, thank you, Kimberly. I see Aurelie wants to add something. Yes, please, Aurelie.
Two things. I'll point that the EU AI Act, doing some publicity, is actually referring to standards as part of the conformity assessment. So that's going to be the standards. They will adopt. Sense and Elect will do an adaptation of the work, but they're relying on the standards work, and they've been involved with to support a conformity assessment for AI system. So that's always worth to note. And just on the point that Kimberly made, I think something to pay attention to. It was raised in the EU AI Act. It was raised also at the Australian Human Rights Commission, the latest paper. It's that maybe to have a reverse burden of proof when you use, because if you can't provide an explanation for your system, is a consideration. And funnily enough, there's a European, the EU's updating their product liability laws to look at AI. So watch that space.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Aurelie. Thank you to all panelists. I'd like now to turn to Q&A session. I see there are a number of questions in the chat as well as Q&A box. And I'd like to ask Kate to help me and identify first questions, since I was listening to the speakers very carefully, didn't have time to read them. Kate, could you maybe point to the first questions that we could discuss here, and then I'll take over. Kate, can you hear me? Well, while Kate is...
sorry, Holly. Yeah, there have been lots of great questions coming through. I've just put into the chat to you one of the first ones that came.
I have such a mixed
okay, so
all the possible questions. Could you maybe just read out?
Sure. Okay, so we've got one here for Kimberly from Sepipour. So there's certainly an issue with distrust of AI, and there needs to be a push towards more transparency and accountability in relation to the use of AI. As distrust increases, for example, after the use of government's use of robo-debt system, organisations using AI may be further incentivized to hide their use of AI. So how do we overcome this increasing distrust when we so regularly hear about things like robo-debt and data leaks?
Well, if I could answer that question in 25 words, yes, right. I would have been appointed to a far more important position than I have been. But look, two things. I mean, one is we can actually start by using best practice, right? There's plenty of guides to best practice. There's plenty of people who can train you in doing things well. There are increasing number of tools, increasing numbers of tools to doing, AI well, data well. We have Tiberio here on the panel who's heading up an organisation that's devoted to doing this better. So doing things well is one. But again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here. We need to actually think about how to make uses that cause harm, make people accountable for that and make people effectively accountable for the harms that they cause using AI systems. And that goes beyond just let's establish some great, some best practices, let's tell people how to do things well. It actually means, I'm a lawyer, it means some better regulatory systems. Whether that's the EU approach of let's do impact assessment and let's make people think this through for all, high-risk systems, or whether that is something, some Australian system that we're going to develop to actually put in place the ability to pursue cases for harm where they occur. But I don't think we can just assume that saying we'll do the right thing and even being very transparent about how we're using these systems is itself going to engender trust. Because if you tell people, oh, we're using all of these systems and we're using all of this data and it's all your personal data and we're making lots and lots of predictions about you and we're, trust us, we're going to do it nicely, I don't think that's ever going to cut it.
Okay. Tiberia, do you have a comment on that as well? Let's see your hand.
Yes. There were so many threads here, and I raised the hand for one purpose, but there are several others already. But I can pick up. I mean, one question I would be very, very keen to sort of address is this question around that I can see here in the list of questions.
Yep.
Around the standards for machine decision making versus the standards for human decision making. Are we demanding more from the machines than from the humans? And as a computer scientist, and speaking for an audience that clearly involves both computer science but lots of lawyers as well, so I feel I have the obligation to sort of make the comment that the ultimate black box is this thing that travels in between our two ears, right? So we've got a really complicated machine inside our skull, and we do believe we understand it. And the reality is that we don't. So ultimately, these automated decisions, they trace back to human decisions. At the end of the day, it's only human decisions. It's human decisions to actually turn the system on. It's humans' decisions to design the AI system. It's human decisions to regulate or not to regulate. It's a human decision to calibrate the system or to call for an independent audit. At the end of the day, it's all ends up with human decision making. So humans are on the hook here. And we need to make sure that the accountability piece is not actually relegated to second plan, as Kim said, and as Aurelie said. Accountability needs to come to the fore. Why? Because of course you can't hold a computer accountable. If you talk about accountability, immediately you stop talking about decisions of computers. You start talking about decisions of people, which is what we should focus on. So we need, in my view, to have this ownership that AI is being built by people, needs to be regulated by people. People need to be on the hook. People need to pay the price in case something goes wrong. AI is just the way we are making our decisions. It's not the source of how our decisions are made. Yeah.
Okay.
Just wanted to add that.
Great. Thanks. Maybe that can lead to another question that we have here from Philip RG about accountability. So he says here that we have a lot of examples of organizations having to register a public officer that isn't a human that takes responsibility. If we require all autonomous devices to be registered with a nominated public officer, would that deliver the necessary accountability? And maybe this is a question for some of the people that are dealing with the standards, Aurelie or Ali. So Aurelie, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, so you've already got, let's say, some cities that are recording the type of algorithm. Think as the audit are being developed, I think it'll be very hard, organization will be hard pressed not to know where the algorithm are and what they're used for. So not sure about registering with a public officer. However, simply just for audit, and I'll pass possibly to Ali on that one, you should have a good idea of what are the algorithm you're using for what purpose and on which data are they being trained. So internally, you should hold a good record of that.
Yeah, I might just add, I agree, it will help in at least being clear what do we expect to be accountable, and then, you know, follow up with that. But definitely it doesn't solve the problem completely. So still we need ways technically to be able to, you know, audit and assess and confirm, make sure that the algorithms are doing the right things and the system has been built the right way.
I would like to read one of the questions about transparency that I find interesting. This Honor is asking, well, I'm just trying to kind of shorten up the question, but being aware of where AI has actually intervened and how often it has intervened is critical to mitigate harmful impact. So it's about, so to say, it's about more like transparency, that we need to know that AI has intervened. So to the panelists, what is the most effective way to make impacted persons or an impacted society aware that automated decision-making has intervened? And should this awareness be seen as a public good that needs to be overseen by government? I think that's a very interesting question, because we know, you know, that when we talk about more standards and probably in legislation, it's more about explainability, how to make, you know, how to ensure that AI decisions are explainable. But this is a different problem about general making public or particular people aware of that AI is being used. I don't know who would like to comment on this question. Any ideas? Maybe. Okay, Kimberly?
That's tricky, isn't it? And it's tricky because, I mean, it's tricky for a couple of reasons. One is it's any impact that Honor's question is identifying is so diffused, you know, tiny little impacts on lots and lots of people. It's a terrific way to make money, and maybe a terrific way to avoid liability, because there's going to be no one person who has, you know, a sufficiently serious claim that they could even consider going to court about, you know, their extra 30 seconds that added up over the course of a year driving past restaurants. But more generally, it's not clear there's anything at all illegal about that, right? And I don't know what kind of legal claim you would start to frame around that. You know, it's actually one of the really interesting parts of the EU AI regulation, is watching the way they've tried to frame some, you know, prohibitions around manipulating people in ways that they're not conscious of. Maybe this is actually an example of manipulating people in ways that they're not conscious of. Although even under the EU AI Act, you know, it would have to cause psychological or physical harm in order to give rise to some sort of liability under the draft, at least as it was published. So not clear there's any kind of legal claim, not clear that, you know, one of those scenarios where it's really difficult to note the impact generally. So if I were asked to propose, like, what's the solution to this kind of thing, it is actually around, you know, funding some sorts of bodies to do research to kind of highlight these diffuse impacts, so we can have a discussion more publicly about whether we consider them acceptable or not. I don't think we've had the discussion that says that's unacceptable yet. So hopefully, you know, research centres like my research centre, Automated Decision Making in Society, have a whole group of people talking about transport, I'll point that one to them. Like that's the sort, we actually have to have a public discussion about what we consider the limits of this kind of manipulation, because it is not straightforward how you would try and prohibit that, much as we might dislike it.
Thanks, Kimberly. Tiberio, you wanted to add something? Please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Just addressing Marina's question in the comment with regards to the need for multidisciplinary involvement in this area. So I'd like to just give my personal experience. It's not really just an opinion, it's actual personal experience, because I come from the hard sciences, so to speak, and computer science, studied physics, that sort of thing. But then at some point I realized that I was just missing so many angles on the problem in order to make actual progress. So at Gradient Institute, where I work, we sort of realized this, fortunately, early on, and we try to learn by bringing into our conversation, into our table, and to try to learn together with a variety of other experts in other fields, in legal scholarship, ethics, social sciences, you name it. And it's amazing how you can cover your blind spots once you actually try to make a genuine interdisciplinary effort. You know, Kim here is a very close collaborator, and I can name several others in other disciplines. And I continue being amazed on a weekly basis by how little I know, you know, simply because by virtue of my specialty, my blind spots. So I'd like to call out that perhaps one of the most important things I've learned in this area is that we need to be really careful when we think we are very confident about something. If we think we are very, very confident about something, then about a statement, about a certain position, AI should be regulated this way, should not be regulated this way. Explainability is important this way, not important this way. I think a critical question is, have you actually asked the same question to people who don't speak your language, who speak a different language? And have you actually, as my friend Nicholas Gruen likes to call, dilemify the problem, create a dilemma, deliberately try to create a challenge, as opposed to the easy way out, which is just find a quick consensus on a fairly inconsequential statement. So really bringing different disciplines together is crucial. And to finalize, because I know I've been going for a while now in this bit of a ramble here, it's not just across different disciplines, but at the end of the day, these systems are making decisions about real people. And the people that are being impacted are often, in the vast majority of the time, not actually being part of this conversation. The whole participation question is crucial. You know, how do we solve those problems? This requires actual, not only multidisciplinary engagement. People need to put their boots on the ground and actually work with the impacted communities and figure out ways to communicate the issues, because those issues are not even appreciated. The people, unless you've been one of the unfortunate, victims of robo-death, for example, you may not even know what's going on. We need to speak more loudly about this, to actually show to the people affected that there is this vast number of decisions made about them that is going under the radar, is not salient, and they have the right to hear about it, and they need to be brought together into this conversation. So I think my point was about multidisciplinarity, the importance of it, and the importance of bringing the impacted communities and people into the conversation, not just the different disciplines or academic disciplines or expertise or industry sectors.
Great, thanks so much, Tiberio, for, I suppose the purpose of this webinar also was this twofold. We tried to bring a few disciplines, certainly not all, around the same table to have different views, and also to try to reach out to as broad public as possible, you know, to raise that question that we want to know about AI and where it's being used and how decisions are generated and how we can, you know, make it happen. I wanted to maybe look at one quite different question. It's from Marina. It's actually about impact of explainability on IP rights and especially trade secrets. So I think Ali was talking about, mentioned trade secret problem. So I understand there is this problem sometimes that you demand for more explainability, but maybe you want to know on which training data the algorithm was trained, or also what are the parameters of trade algorithm, and then you can't get access to that information because it's protected by trade secrets. So is it a problem in practice? Has it been a clear problem? And what we can do about that? Is it, it's probably, you know, also policy question, but I would like to hear your views, Ali.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I think I mentioned about that because there is definitely sensitivities about it in the business side, worrying about the trade secrets. But I believe there is still a lot that can be shared and explained before they start getting worried about those trade secrets. And currently in the market, what we see is not enough is being shared for various different other reasons. And that excuse, I don't find it strong enough. So lots of explanations about how the system has been designed, what sort of data was used for training it, what sort of tests has been run on it, and all of those various different explanations which can be shared with public to gain that trust without exposing those core trade secrets that could be the main issue.
Great. Kimberly, as a lawyer with IP background, what are your views on that? Do you think trade secrets is a problem, and do we have to do anything to solve it?
Yeah, what Ali said. I mean, well, look, you know, that's too trite. He's absolutely right that there are an awful lot of circumstances where trade secret questions just shouldn't arise at all. You can give a person an explanation of the main factors that influence their decision without revealing anything of the underlying model. If there's a need to go deeper, a need to go broader, then, you know, if you're in court, for example, courts have terrific systems for protecting confidential information. They can close the courts, they can close some evidence. Yeah, there are a lot of ways to deal with the trade secrets question, and it is way too easy too often just to say, oh, it's all commercial in confidence. Like, no, it's not really. You know, you can do a lot before you even get to questions that might raise commercial in confidence questions. Other things that we do need to do, absolutely there are. You know, if government is going to procure a system, it needs to make sure it has all the information and rights it needs in order to provide the kinds of reasons for decisions that it is obliged to as a matter of democratic accountability and or natural justice. So, you know, attention needs to be paid to these things, you know, for example, in procurement processes. Now, even in the private sector, if you might have to explain something, you don't want to hit a trade secret barrier at some later point that you didn't deal with when you were contracting for procurement of a system. So, yeah, absolutely, these things need to be thought about. And as I put in the chat in answering, you know, a very similar question, there's some interesting work being done at the moment. Trade secret is like the hottest issue in IP academia at the moment because everyone's realised we know very little about it, because it's secret. But there's some really interesting work being done by Tanya Aplin and I think Sharon Sandine at the moment, where they're looking particularly those questions around the confidentiality of the underlying data and what that means and what sorts of exceptions already exist, what sorts of laws already exist to get access to the kinds of things that are necessary in order to really assess a system. So I would say watch this space. There's a conference, I think next week, maybe EPIP is coming up, where there's a whole lot of trade secrets presentations. As I said, Tanya Applin's doing some interesting work. So there's places to follow up if you're interested in those questions.
Thank you, Kimberly. I'm already even making notes because this is something that's very interesting for me. So I'm just trying to read all the chat going on.
Can I raise a question that I really liked?
Sure.
And I'm going to have to go back and find it. But Carolyn McKay asked earlier, if AI is so unexplainable and opaque, what is the basis for its perceived objectivity? I'm comparing this with perceptions of discretion, subjectivity exercised by human judicial officers. That is a good question. Why is it? Does anyone want to have a go at that one?
I might start with saying it also relates to the other question I think Liria mentioned. What is AI in this context? So if we consider AI as the broader definition of any sort of automated algorithmic decisioning kind of process, then it's not so unexplainable. We have a wide variety of that AI which is explainable, and still it can achieve good performances, and it is being publicly and broadly used in many different systems. There are only some versions, some specific algorithms, and then we get to more and more complex methods, which becomes difficult to explain. And again, the definition of explain itself is also important. We can explain in a probably like complex mathematical way that what is this algorithm and how it comes into its decisions, but that explanation might not be useful enough. And that's when we need to go to the other workarounds and explain in different ways and simpler ways. So in general, just wanted to say, I see there are limitations, but it's to a good extent quite explainable in a lot of cases. Hand over to you, Tiberio.
Absolutely agree, Ali. I think Carolyn's question is brilliant because it actually points exactly at this misunderstanding that machines are necessarily less explainable than people, right? As Carolyn's question sort of makes clear, think about discretion. Discretion is a really good example. If you ask a person to exercise discretion, how do you actually explain how that person went through the process of actually ending up with a final decision? How do you do that? Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a computer scientist, and my hunch is that you can't really explain. Because if you could have explained, or if you could have, you can give a high-level explanation, but it's really hard because your discretion is this idea of giving people not only talking about the authority, but this ability to analyze context, which changes dramatically from situation to situation. Now, much, as Ali said, so much of the objectivity of AI is related to the fact that it's not as unexplainable as people think. In fact, if you have a system that you've designed and you want to test what will happen, which outcome will come out once you put in a certain input, you can test that. Not only that, you can actually ask questions like, what would have happened an hour ago in the system if instead of providing the input I did provide an hour ago, I had provided a different input? And if you have control of that system, you can actually answer that question. You can never answer that question for people. You can never know what a human would have done. You can ask them, what would you have done in this situation? They can tell you a story, but you don't actually know what they would have done. Now, with a machine, it's not like that. You can ask the machine, what would you have done 1 hour ago if instead of seeing this image, you had seen this other image? And you just put the other image in front of the machine into the input, and you compute the output, and you get exactly what the machine would have done. So excellent question. Really pleased that it was asked, and really, pleased, Kim, that you actually noticed that and brought this into the conversation.
Thank you, Tiberio. And now, Aurélie, I would, that would be the last comment, because our time is finishing, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yes, so picking up on Tiberio and the different study, very well illustrated. I think that's where it's going to be very interesting ride for lawyers, because before, as a lawyer, you would have to explain what was that discretion that was taken. And as an ex-litigation lawyer, I used to, go through the best argument on how this was the right way, the right path that was decided based on the evidence at hand. So you would have to work retroactively. So now you've got the evidence firsthand, like as a system is built. So for the lawyers, it's going to become really interesting, because the litigation starts there. So you'll have to do the advice on explaining why the system that was built was the best system that was built. So litigation in reverse.
Well, I would like to thank all panelists very, very much for a very interesting and inspiring discussion. I think we covered much more than than I at least expected. Very many different perspectives and different interesting questions for the audience. So my huge thanks to the audience as well for their active participation in the chat box, and it was very interesting to see all the perspectives. Our time is finished for the section today, but I hope this session helped to, if not start, then continue the discussion of whether we need transparency explainability, in which context, and how we could try to promote it from industry perspective, legal, and technological perspective. I will now ask Kate to close the event.
Okay, great. I think we've got a last slide coming up where we can show some upcoming events. There we go, great. So thank you for a great discussion. It's certainly a subject we see coming up more and more in our practice at Bird and Bird. Before we go, I'll just let you know about some upcoming events which are being run by the Australian Society for Computers in the Law. Firstly, next Tuesday on the 6th of September, we've got the event called The Future We Create, Legal Tech for Good. And then on Monday, the 27th of September, we have War and Peace in the Age of AI. So that should be another great discussion on the issues surrounding artificial intelligence. If you like to keep up to date with topical issues on the intersection of technology and law, you can subscribe to the AUSCL at the address given up there on the slide. So that's the end of today's presentation. Thanks everyone for joining in. Have a good evening, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.